Serial killers, we all know the names. Bundy, Dahmer, this guy on Netflix called Ed Gein, and we've all noticed something strange. Why were nearly all the famous ones American? At one point, the United States had 66% of the world's identified serial killers while holding only 4% of the total world population. That's insane. Even more curious though, this whole phenomenon spiked between the 70s and the 90s, right when the Cold War was at its chilliest. American fast food chains, blue jeans, and rock music, those cultural exports crossed borders. But serial killers, apparently those didn't. Or did they? Because here's the thing, the Eastern Bloc absolutely had serial killers. Some were worse than their American counterparts. And yet, almost no one in the West has heard about them, because communist governments worked hard to bury the truth. Today, we're diving into a part of Cold War history that almost nobody talks about. What happens when a society obsessed with surveillance and control tries to pretend serial killers don't exist? Let's take a look. Now, first, we're talking about individuals who killed multiple people on their own, not state leaders directing mass repression. So no, Mao, Stalin, or Pol Pot do not count here. They were architects of political terror, not serial killers in the same sense as Ted Bundy was, sprinting around with a metal rod chasing his victims. First, we need to start with the USSR, because it produced arguably the most terrifying serial killer in history, Andrei Chikatilo, or the Red Ripper. Yeah, that really was his nickname. I guess the newsroom didn't push themselves too hard on that one, but anyway. Born in the Ukrainian SSR in 1936, Chikatilo entered a world shaped by famine, terror, and silence. According to journalist Michael Newton and historian Robert Conquest, he may have had an older brother Stepan who was cannibalized by starving neighbors during the Holodomor. It's never been fully verified, but the rumor haunted Chikatilo's childhood and his own later recollections. He grew up hungry, literally hungry, claiming he didn't taste bread until he was 12. He was bullied for weakness and poverty, yet ironically by his teens he was a model Soviet youth. He was an editor of his school newspaper, a loyal communist, and a hard-working student. But when he failed to get into Moscow University, his life unraveled. He drifted through labor jobs and then became a school teacher, which is quite horrifying in hindsight. In 1978, he murdered a 9-year-old girl, and this is where the Soviet system failed catastrophically. Police had evidence pointing straight at Chikatilo, but the USSR had a quota-driven justice system. They needed a culprit and not necessarily the right one. They arrested another man and, despite his alibi, pressured his wife into changing her testimony, convicted him, and after commuting his sentence, ultimately executed him in 1983 for a murder Chikatilo committed. And this wasn't a one-off mistake. According to former Soviet investigators, and especially Russian criminologist Mikhail Vinogradov, who spoke openly after 1991, the entire system was designed to look like it was solving crime and not actually solve it. Soviet policing revolved around case closure quotas known as raskrivaemost. That statistic, the percentage of cases officially solved, mattered more than accuracy, evidence, or even catching the real perpetrator. If you could pin the crime on someone, or anyone, the numbers went up. In a system where promotions, budgets, and political favor depended on quotas, the pressure to solve cases quickly was enormous. At the same time, Soviet criminology, again confirmed by Vinogradov, treated serial murder as a capitalist pathology, a system of Western moral decay caused by alienation, inequality, and the breakdown of community. In the ideological narrative of the USSR, serial killers were something the other side produced, not socialism. So when patterns emerged that pointed towards a serial offender, police weren't encouraged to investigate the possibility. They were encouraged to ignore it, because admitting the existence of a serial killer meant admitting a flaw in the system. In other words, serial killers weren't supposed to exist in socialism, so they officially didn't. So what did that mean for Chikatilo? Well, he kept killing. Kids, both boys and girls, women, more than 50 victims in total. Some say 53, some say more. The worst part, when he was first detained, forensic science in the USSR was so underdeveloped that they didn't understand how his blood type could differ from certain forensic evidence collected at the scenes, leading them to wrongly rule him out and set him free. By the late 1980s, glasnost finally allowed newspapers to report on the killings, breaking decades of silence. Public pressure mounted and surveillance increased. Police work finally improved, and then, by sheer luck, an officer noticed Chikatilo walking out of a forest looking suspicious and bleeding from a bite wound inflicted by his final victim. He was soon arrested, interrogated, and finally confessed to dozens of murders. By the time he stood trial, the Soviet Union had collapsed. He had killed for so long, the country he committed the crimes in no longer existed. His crimes were tried in the Russian Federation, being the first public news trial after the collapse of the USSR. After a highly publicized court spectacle where he ranted, mocked victims' families, and had to be kept inside a metal cage for the proceedings, he was found guilty of 52 murders and sentenced to death. And on February 14, 1994, Andrei Chikatilo was taken to Novocherkassk prison. There was no dramatic last meal, no drawn-out ritual, and no witnesses. He was led to a soundproof room and was executed with a single gunshot behind his right ear. After years of failure, cover-ups, and ideological blindness, the system, although no longer Soviet now, handled Chikatilo's final moments with cold bureaucratic efficiency, the one thing it claimed to excel at. But his execution reveals something bigger and something that runs through every case you're about to see. Communist governments couldn't afford to admit that they didn't have total control. The appearance of order mattered more than actually maintaining it. So if the public could have helped identify a killer, even if they had seen something suspicious or recognized a pattern, they were never given the chance because they were never told the truth. In a strange irony, the societies that preached unity, solidarity, and collective struggle were often the ones whose citizens were left in the dark the most. You can't warn your neighbors if you don't know there's danger. You can't be vigilant if the state insists there's nothing to see. And that wasn't just a Soviet phenomenon, it was an Eastern Bloc one. Across the Eastern Bloc, communist governments routinely framed serial killers as a Western problem, a kind of capitalist pathology born from social decay. Soviet criminology taught that serious crime arose from class antagonism, alienation, and the breakdown of community under capitalism. In Marxist-Leninist theory, once class inequality was abolished, the deeper roots of violent criminality were supposed to disappear as well. So the idea that a serial killer could emerge inside a socialist society wasn't just uncomfortable, it was ideologically impossible. That meant when predators like Chikatilo surfaced, the system had no framework for understanding them. Police lacked training, newspapers were muzzled, and any emergent pattern that contradicted the party line was quickly ignored. And in practice, whenever a serial murderer did appear behind the Iron Curtain, the priority wasn't to warn the public or mount a wide investigation. It was to protect the ideology, preserve the illusion of control, and insist that socialism was immune to such capitalist disorders. It was to protect the ideology first and foremost. And nowhere was this more evident in Nicolae Ceausescu's Romania, a country that prided itself on discipline, obedience, and moral purity, even while a real-life vampire stalked the streets of Bucharest. If Chikatilo exposed the failures of Soviet justice, then Romania's most infamous predator, Ion Rimaru, shattered Ceausescu's illusion that socialism had cleansed society of Western-style deviance. His crimes were so brutal, so animalistic, and so politically inconvenient that the Romanian state buried almost every detail for nearly 20 years. Between 1970 and 1971, Bucharest was terrorized by a sadistic predator, Ion Rimaru, eventually linked to 4 murders and more than a dozen brutal assaults. While being nowhere near as prolific as Chikatilo, his crimes were still nonetheless just as horrific. His victims were mostly young women walking home late or living in ground floor apartments, and the way he attacked them sent shockwaves through the investigators who handled the case. Rimaru struck at night, often during storms, convinced the rain made him harder to be noticed. He bludgeoned women, essayed them, and left vicious bite wounds across their bodies, so deep and ragged that some officers initially wondered whether an animal had been involved. All the while, the Romanian public remained completely unaware that a serial killer was on the loose. When police finally arrested him, the case only grew more weird. During interrogations, Rimaru claimed he was like a wolf, howled in his cell, and bit guards. Psychiatrists later described him as severely psychopathic, violently delusional, and entirely devoid of empathy. But the most disturbing twist came from the forensic work. Early testing suggested that the killer's blood traits matched a completely different man, Rimaru's father, Florea, who had died years earlier. Investigators dug into old police files from the 1940s and discovered that Florea had been suspected of a series of eerily similar attacks. Nighttime break-ins, violent assaults on women, and brutal sexual violence that almost mirrored his son's crimes. Even the names of their first known victims were strikingly similar, a coincidence so unsettling it left investigators speechless. The parallels between father and son were so uncanny that Romanian criminologists later described the case as hereditary horror. It's an odd irony given that socialist ideology blames serial killers on capitalist moral decay rather than anything biological or hereditary that could be passed down. But anyway, moving on. Rimaru's 1971 trial was quick. He alternated between hysterics and begging for his life, but none of it mattered. On October the 23rd that same year, he was executed by a firing squad after collapsing and attempting to bite a guard one last time. He was buried in an unmarked grave, and for years the regime kept his crimes quiet. Ion Rimaru became only known later as the Vampire of Bucharest, a killer whose brutality shocked detectives and whose family history made the case even more disturbing. And if Romania struggled to catch a killer like this, what about East Germany, the most surveyed society in Europe? Let's head to the GDR. If there was one place in the Eastern Bloc where you'd imagine a serial killer couldn't exist, it was East Germany. This was the land of the Stasi, a surveillance apparatus so vast it employed over 90,000 officers and relied on nearly 170,000 informants. Roughly 1 in every 63 East Germans was spying or reporting in some capacity. The government listened to phones, opened mail, and monitored friendships, workplaces, and even marriages. If you breathed too loudly, the Stasi probably had a file on it. And yet, despite this suffocating level of state control, a serial killer still managed to operate inside the GDR. Worse, the system failed to recognize him, stop him, or even acknowledge that his crimes were happening. His name was Erwin Hagedorn, a 17-year-old who murdered 3 boys between 1969 and 1971 in the forests around Truhenbrützen. Their victims were aged between 8 and 12. He lured them away, assaulted them, strangled them, and left their bodies in wooded areas, the kind of pattern that anywhere else would have triggered urgent warnings to parents and a public manhunt. But East Germany didn't want patterns. Patterns meant acknowledging that something was very wrong. In the GDR, murders weren't just crimes, they were ideological threats. Like Romania and the USSR, East Germany insisted that socialism produced orderly, morally superior citizens, people supposedly immune to the decadent pathologies of the capitalist West. So when boys began disappearing and turning up dead, the Stasi treated the case not as a public danger, but as a political problem. Parents were never warned, newspapers weren't allowed to report a single detail. Investigators worked behind closed doors under intense pressure, but without the ability to communicate publicly or appeal for witnesses. Instead of acknowledging that a serial predator was hunting children, the state buried the truth under layers of secrecy. When Hagedorn was eventually caught in 1971, almost by accident after making a suspicious comment while drunk, the regime's response revealed its deeper failure. Rather than admit publicly that a serial child killer had operated in a socialist society, the Stasi classified the entire case. The trial was held behind closed doors. Victims' families were only given the bare minimum information. No official statement ever acknowledged the existence of a serial killer in the GDR. And in 1972, Hagedorn was executed with a single shot to the back of the head, the only criminal in East German history to be executed solely for murder. The fact that this was the lone exception shows just how far the regime would go to avoid admitting that anything so shameful could happen under its watch. For all its surveillance, East Germany built a system designed to catch enemies and not killers, and when a murderer didn't fit the ideological script, the Stasi simply closed the curtains. But if East Germany, the most monitored society in Europe, could fail to see a predator operating within its borders, imagine what this looked like in a country even more paranoid, even more isolated, and even more obsessed with maintaining the illusion of perfect social order. In a place where the state didn't just monitor its citizens, it smothered them. That place was Albania under Enver Hoxha, the most sealed-off, anxious, and tightly controlled regime in the entire Eastern Bloc. If there ever was a country that shouldn't have had serial killers, it was Albania under Enver Hoxha, a place so isolated and tightly controlled it made East Germany look laid back. The Sigurimi monitored everything, neighbours, families, stray conversations, so thoroughly that many Albanians joked the only safe place to speak was in their dreams. Under that level of surveillance, doing anything suspicious, let alone committing multiple murders, was basically impossible. And because of that, Albania holds a strange distinction. There was no recorded serial killers during the communist era. None. Officially, it was the perfect socialist state, at least if you measure perfection by the number of serial killers in the archives. Not that Albanians weren't killing each other, they just did it the old-fashioned way. Blood feuds, or gyakmarja, sometimes stretched across generations, especially in the north, producing clusters of revenge killings that had nothing to do with serial predation and everything to do with medieval honor codes. If someone was murdered, it was usually because their grandfather failed to protect a guest in their vicinity during a dinner in 1920. And besides, under Hoxha's government, blood feud killings were outlawed and cracked down on hard. Unironically, this might have been one of the more progressive policies ever made by a communist government. After the regime collapsed, journalists and researchers encountered persistent rumors of violent crimes that were never publicly acknowledged at the time. case is allegedly resolved quickly by authorities and then erased from the record. None can be conclusively verified today, largely because Sigurimi archives remain incomplete or inaccessible. So while the rest of the Eastern Bloc grappled with predators hiding in ideological blind spots, Albania's solution was simple: keep the country so tightly sealed that even a serial killer couldn't find room to operate. If Albania under Hodja was the one place in the Eastern Bloc where serial killers officially didn't exist, then Czechoslovakia had the grim opposite. Their killer was a man called Ladislav Hoja, quiet, unnoticed, a factory worker with the charisma of a filing cabinet and a below-average IQ of 88, went on to become one of Czechoslovakia's most disturbing predators. Between 1978 and 1982, he murdered 5 women across Prague and other cities, and investigators later suspected he may have had more victims who were never identified. What made Hoja terrifying wasn't theatrics, it was how ordinary he appeared. He had no dramatic childhood trauma, no dramatic public presence, and no ideological grievances. He simply blended into socialist life, unnoticed by neighbours, co-workers, or even the state really. His crimes were methodical: isolated victims, sudden attacks, essays, and strangulation. Each scene echoed the last, a clear signature, but one that the system was slow to recognise. As in other Eastern Bloc countries, Czechoslovak authorities hesitated to admit that a serial killer could exist in their perfect socialist society. Murders were reported cautiously, sexual crimes were played down, and police units often worked in isolation. Newspapers were obviously not allowed to speculate about patterns or warn the public. Official silence gave Hoja room to move. When he was finally arrested in 1982, his confession stunned investigators. He described the killings calmly, almost clinically, and with no remorse. Psychiatrists concluded that he suffered from a profound paraphilic disorder, the kind of diagnosis Western profilers would instantly flag, but which remained almost unknown in the socialist criminology textbook. Hoja was executed in 1986, hanged in a Prague prison. Only after the fall of communism did the public learn the full details of his crimes and realize how easily he navigated a system that claimed to prevent exactly this type of violence. Next, we move on to Hungary. If there's one case that perfectly exposes how a socialist system could catastrophically fail its own people, it's Hungary's Martfu monster, a killer whose crimes were horrific enough on their own, but whose investigation became one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in Cold War Europe. It began in 1957 in the industrial town of Martfu. A young woman was found strangled and mutilated near the Tisa shoe factory area. The murder shocked the community, but the police response was immediate and damning. Desperate to show efficiency and preserve stability under the early Kadar regime, authorities arrested János Kordiak and almost immediately claimed they had their man. They built the case around him, coerced a confession, and sentenced him to life imprisonment. Case closed. Socialism triumphant. No serial killer here. But, of course, the murders didn't stop. Over the following years, women continued being found dead, strangled or assaulted around Martfu and nearby settlements. Despite the recurring pattern, the state repeatedly refused to reopen the investigation. A serial killer was clearly active, but the authorities ignored the obvious. The real killer turned out to be Peter Kovacs, a nondescript, ordinary man, a truck driver employed by the shoe factory, living a stable life, married and considered respectable by his employer and community. After watching an Argentine movie called Abuso de Confianza, there was a scene where a man acted violently towards a woman. Kovacs was supposedly so excited by the scene that he decided to go and act violently towards a woman once the film had ended, and murdered a woman returning home from that said shoe factory. Over the course of a decade from 1957 through 1967, Kovacs murdered at least 4 women, possibly even more. Kovacs operated for years because reopening the case meant admitting the police had locked up an innocent man. In a system where image mattered more than truth, that was a risk that they refused to take. The turning point came not through a surviving victim, but through mounting investigative pressure. Following yet another murder, investigators renewed their focus on Kovacs as inconsistencies in his movements and alibi became apparent despite his wife's attempts to corroborate them. Eyewitnesses placed him with the victim shortly before her death, and glass fragments found on his clothing, linked to a recent windshield breaking incident at the shoe factory, strengthened the case and led to his arrest on August the 11th, 1967. By February 1968, he had confessed to multiple murders and attacks. His execution followed later that year on December the 1st by hanging. Meanwhile, János Kordiak, the innocent man who had paid for decades of wrongful imprisonment, was released after 11 years behind bars. The state never offered reconciliation, apology, or compensation. If doing someone dirty was a sport, the Hungarian communist government would be taking home that gold medal. The Martvu monster case is infamous not just because of the murders, but because it revealed the lengths to which the justice system would go to avoid admitting failure. It showed what happens in society where preserving the illusion of control is more important than protecting actual people's lives. Even so, the victims and revisited files finally exposed what the state had denied for too long, proving that lies and ideology can be as deadly as a serial killer. Up next, we have Poland, home to one of the most unsettling cases in the Eastern Bloc, the vampire of Bytov, a man so dangerous that even after confessing to dozens of murders, investigators believe he might have been responsible for far more. If the Eastern Bloc had one killer who resembled the scale and horror of Chikatilo in the USSR, it was Poland's Leszek Bakalski. Like Chikatilo, Bakalski drifted across rural communities for years, sleeping in barns, taking odd jobs, and stalking isolated women and children throughout the 80s and early 90s. And just like Chikatilo, he likely killed well over 50 people, with investigators suspecting dozens more than he ever formally admitted. His crimes shed the same grim pattern seen in the USSR: opportunistic, frenzied, and grotesque. Strangulation, stabbing, and essays, whatever method suited the moment. When he was finally arrested in 1992 after the fall of communism, Bakalski shocked investigators by confessing to around 80 murders. That's right, 80. The true number remains uncertain, but even conservative estimates place him among the deadliest serial killers in European history. And yet, the most bizarre part of the case is what came next. Because Poland's communist-era records were so fragmented, poorly preserved, or simply missing, prosecutors were only able to secure a conviction for a single murder. Not because he was innocent, but because the evidence trail from the 80s had collapsed alongside the political system that produced it. In many ways, his case reflected the same institutional blindness and bureaucratic decay that had allowed Chikatilo to operate for so long. Unlike Chikatilo though, after serving his sentence, Bakalski was released from prison in 2017. But release didn't mean freedom. He was subsequently confined indefinitely to a secure psychiatric facility. His true body count will likely never be known, but he remains one of the most chilling examples of how a collapsing communist system allowed a predator to slip through its cracks for years. Now, by this point you might be wondering, what about serial killers in a more open, less tightly controlled communist system? What happened in a country that wasn't sealed off like Albania or micromanaged like East Germany, a place where people moved more freely, borders existed but were porous, and the government wasn't watching every whisper? For that, we turn to Yugoslavia, a federation far looser than the rest of the Eastern Bloc, where one murderer slipped effortlessly across internal republic borders for over a decade, almost becoming a Balkan folk villain in the process. Few killers in communist Europe lasted as long or evaded police as successfully as Vinko Pintaric, a Croatian-born criminal who spent the 70s and 80s drifting through Croatia and Slovenia like a ghost. Pintaric lived half his life hiding in forests, stealing food from farms, and occasionally walking into town disguised in women's clothing, one of his stranger habits, simply to avoid recognition. He killed at least 5 people, including partners, acquaintances, and unlucky strangers he encountered while on the run. Pintaric exploited the internal borders of Yugoslavia brilliantly. Each republic had its own police force, and cooperation was very clumsy at best. While Croatia looked for him in one district, he slipped into Slovenia. When Slovenia sent patrols into the mountains, he doubled back to his hometown like a phantom. Unlike in the USSR, East Germany, or even Bulgaria, where newspapers were forbidden from reporting on serial killers altogether, Yugoslav media operated with comparatively more freedom. And that meant that Pintaric's story didn't disappear into a classified file. Instead, local newspapers wrote about him with a strange blend of fear, irritation, and reluctant fascination. In some headlines, he was a danger, in others a ghost-like outlaw who seemed forever one step ahead of the authorities. Over time, he gained kind of a folkloric aura, not admired but undeniably mythologized as the bandit the state could never quite catch. This is because Pintaric's story is basically one long escape. After his first killing in 1973, he disappeared for weeks, turned himself in, and then promptly broke out of a psychiatric hospital and went on the run again. Prison didn't hold him either. In 1982, he literally wrote his own name onto a prison leave list and walked out, later bragging in a letter that petitions were useless and this was only the beginning. Caught, injured, and then resentenced, he escaped again in 1989 by simply not returning from a day's leave. From there, he lived like a hunted outlaw, moving through forests, hiding in isolated cottages, and twice shooting his way out when police came close. Each escape made him more reckless, more paranoid, and more dangerous. His story didn't end though until 1991 on the eve of Yugoslavia's collapse. Police finally traced him to a house where he had been hiding. After refusing to surrender, a siege erupted into a gunfight. Pintaric was killed in the shootout, ending a manhunt that had stretched across more than a decade and multiple republics. In the end, his story wasn't about ideology though, it was about borders, bureaucracy, and a man who understood the cracks of Yugoslavia better than the forces hunting him down. Finally, if you want to take the strangest and most uniquely communist example of how a totalitarian state handled a serial killer, look no further than Bulgaria. Its most disturbing Cold War predator is a man whose name you still can't find in any newspaper, archive, or crime database because the government never released it. And in a strange way, you might think that that's actually admirable, like when news outlets don't report the names of school shooters since it prevents glorification or sensationalism. But it's also deeply bizarre, the purest example of how a communist regime tried to confront a serial killer by simply erasing him from existence. The man's murder spree began in late 1979 when police discovered the mutilated body of a 19-year-old woman inside an abandoned building in Sofia. She had been stabbed 35 times with clear signs of SA. Investigators assumed it was an isolated attack until another young woman was found in almost the same condition, and then another, and another. By early 1980, detectives realized they had a serial killer on their hands, one targeting vulnerable young women, often sex workers, striking late at night around deserted parts of the capital. Behind the scenes, the police were scrambling. Witness interviews and forensic traces eventually led them to a 23-year-old man, a former Ministry of Interior employee actually, which only made the case more sensitive. Once in custody, he then confessed to 5 murders. And then the story disappears. No name released, no photographs, no trial reports, and nothing in the state press. He was sentenced to death and executed quietly not long after, but the public never knew who he was, what he did, or even that a serial killer had been active in Sofia at all. The only reason that we even know that this man existed is because of a Radio Free Europe article that was published outlining how Bulgaria was rife with crime during its communist era. To this day, researchers refer to him simply as the unnamed Sofia serial killer, because the state erased everything except the internal police files that resurfaced decades later. It's one of the only cases in Europe where a fully identified serial killer was caught, confessed, sentenced, and executed, yet remains publicly nameless. Every communist state in Europe, whether tightly controlled or more loosely federated, produced its own monsters, sometimes in spite of the system and often because the system refused to acknowledge them. Serial killers don't disappear just because ideology says they shouldn't exist. Except, of course, Albania, the most isolated, paranoid, obsessively controlled socialist state of them all. The one true utopia, apparently, because according to the archives it had no serial killers whatsoever. Either way, serial killers were never a uniquely American problem. They exist across the Eastern Bloc, and they continue to appear around the world today, even as modern surveillance and forensic technology have reduced how often they slip through the cracks. Communist countries had them. Post-communist countries still have them. Even China, long after the fall of the USSR, saw one of the deadliest in its history with Yang Qinghai in the early 2000s. The truth is simple. Serial killers are not born from capitalism, communism, class inequality, or moral decay. They emerge in every system, every ideology, and every society. No political model has ever fully prevented them, and none probably ever will.